Political impasse continues in Lebanon. I'm curious, from your vantage point, how much has Saad Hariri's resignation complicated this already intractable political crisis?
First of all, hello, and it definitely even complicated even more the situation in the country because previously there was some sort of a consensus over Hariri leading the government formation process, whether on the international level or whether also locally. Of course, on the regional level, we know that there's a veto or some so-called veto by Saudi Arabia on Saad Hariri particularly, which kind of complicated his drive in order to form or kind of made him lose leverage in his negotiation process with the different Lebanese stakeholders in terms of forming a government. But the problem is right now, and this is something Saad Hariri signaled last night in a pre-scheduled interview on a local TV station. He said that he will not be naming any candidate to replace him as a prime minister designate and to form a government, and he might not even give the vote of confidence for this prime minister if he manages to form a government. So what does this mean? This means that any new government that might be formed that probably the other political stakeholders in the country agree on will not or will lack the confidence of one of the major constituencies in the country, which makes it hopping on one foot instead of two or three foot, for example, in terms of applying the much needed reforms. No prime minister will dare touch the very explosive files in the country in terms of reforms without having the full support of all the different factions in the country. This is why Saad Hariri yesterday raised the stakes by announcing that, in addition to the fact that he kind of hinted at the role of Hezbollah basically in not pressuring enough the current sitting president in terms of to drive actually the government formation process, which will also kind of exasperate tension between the different constituencies in the country.
The European Union has said it wants to agree by the end of July on a legal framework for a package of sanctions targeting Lebanese leaders. Do you think that the EU will actually do that? And if they do, what would those sanctions look like?
I think the EU is definitely heading in that direction after almost a year of throwing a lifeline for the Lebanese sectarian ruling elite, which symbolized the French initiative by President Emmanuel Macron, who arrived in Beirut right after the August 4 explosion that rocked the heart of the city. So the French were heavily involved in the process of trying to form a government in Lebanon, and they have a first row experience of how difficult, how complex that process is, and who are the disruptive factors in forming a government that can actually start implementing certain reforms to try and save what is left of the country. So, and the French have basically worked relentlessly over the past few months in trying to achieve a consensus within the European Union in order to officially announced their intention of their intention to implement sanctions on Lebanese politicians. What will those sanctions be? I think they're mostly going to target probably tier 1 or tier 2 politicians as a first step, maybe their advisors, their bank accounts, trying to strip them of their visas. We know that many of the members of the sectarian ruling elite in Lebanon kind of have other passports, so they might be banned from travel. And we know that many of the Lebanese politicians actually withdrew their money over the past 2 years or even more, or they transferred their money abroad, and they're kind of relying on those bank accounts outside in order to re-establish themselves in the coming phase in Lebanon, especially when election times come. So this is something that might complicate their plans, the plans of the Lebanese political sectarian elite. But am I too hopeful that this will drive the country and the different Lebanese constituents in order to achieve some sort of an agreement over a new government? I'm not that hopeful, because Previously, when, for example, the U.S. State Department targeted Gibran Bassil, who is the son-in-law of the current sitting president and who is the head of the largest parliamentary bloc in the parliament, nothing happened. Gibran Bassil did not back down. Gibran Bassil actually leveraged that in order to tighten his relationship with Hezbollah and in order to demand more and more from Hezbollah, which kind of gave him the cushion in the current or in the previous negotiations that were happening with Prime Minister designate Saad Hariri in order to refuse or turn down any of the propositions by Hariri or even turn down the international pressure that was signified whether by the Egyptians or the French or the Americans or what have you. So this is definitely it is something that should happen. It is something that also reflects on the Europeans in general and their talk about principles and upholding those principles. But will it solve the problem in Lebanon? I'm really skeptical, and we'll see by the
International mediation has failed to bridge the differences between Lebanese leaders. Is there any international actor at this point who can play a more effective mediating role?
It's not an effective mediating role as much as it's a role of pushing things forward. And I think the only player, a regional player that can do that is actually Iran, surprisingly, or not, because the main powerhouse in Lebanon at the moment is Hezbollah, and Hezbollah can dictate things almost entirely on the different constituencies of the country. And Hezbollah is the closest ally of the president and retains very good relations with all the different constituencies. No one today opposes Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon. No one wants to fight against Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon. So Hezbollah holds the keys, if it wants, to drive the situation forward. But I don't think it has intentions to do that. And the trade-off or the cost-benefit approach, which Christoph mentioned, is still not ripe enough for it to move forward from the current regime in its form and the current balances, which favors its influence over the country.
All right, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Rana Khouri, Bashar Al-Halabi, and Christoph Abi Nassif. And thank you too for